So for this one, I want to talk about Avowed, which is a game that I played recently. For me, I'm going to preface this with there's going to be spoilers. Not anything too specific, but if you're a real stickler about that, definitely don't listen if you don't want to. Also, my perspective on this is that I am a talky shooty enthusiast, as I like to say it. I like games where you can, shoot things and talk. I also am somewhat of a enjoyer of first-person melee combat. That's kind of a unique category of games, and this game sort of falls into that. So I'm very kind of excited to check this one out. And I also sort of have made the joke that I think immersive sims are a replacement for my personality. So those are all kind of very interesting things to sort of come in to Avowed to, because it's kind of coming from more of an RPG background and much less of like a first-person shooter background, if you will. Now, the too long didn't listen sort of version of this is about as better than you think. And don't believe in all the chud lore. There was like a lot of people who were, I think, still high on some concerns that they had with other games, and so they kind of just brought them over. And then also, I think that kind of the launch of Avowed came at an unfortunate time for a few different reasons. But as far as the game itself, I do feel like it was pretty good. Specifically, I'm going to call it the combat. It was pretty fun, and the way they designed the game was in a way that allowed you to easily switch your combat style. You could go in like one part of the game, and then if you really wanted to, you could start using completely different weapons, or just based on stuff you found. There was like a lot of like kind of push also to get people to sort of change things around, which is I think a good thing. But it did kind of come into odds with sort of the resource management of the game itself. There was definitely a big push for people to be like breaking down sort of items that they were getting, but I also feel like that's kind of a big ask when these are unique items and players, if you give them a toy, they don't want to take it apart and make their other toy that they've been playing with for so long better. They want to try out the new toy. So I think there was just a little bit of at odds there, and that when it came down to character build, the only thing that really seemed to matter is if you were investing more into mana or more into stamina. You could though power through any of these problems though with like food and potions. Like if you didn't have enough stamina or health or whatever, you could just load up on certain food items and just hit the easy button for some combat encounters. And that was kind of important to have in this game because they definitely need a difficulty release valve of some sort. Really every game kind of needs to have that, and it's good that like if you start to engage with all the systems, you could kind of stack an encounter in your favor. And as far as the playstyle that I sort of gravitated towards is I started out using guns, and I kind of just kept doing that until like at the end of the game I had two pistols, and they dealt enough stun damage that after since I'm shooting them both at the same time, after two shots with each one, enemies were starting to like basically get locked into their stuns. So I could kind of use this as like just a way to sort of stun lock enemies and take out some of the bigger threats. But that being said, I did like the enemy variety. It took a long time for that to kind of start to get old, but it eventually did. But for the most part, I did like that they had a really good way of kind of preventing the player from focusing on killing the sort of weakest opponent. That tends to be the best strategy in most games. Here, what they did is they had these priest characters that would come in and they would sort of heal other enemies, so they kind of had to be the ones you killed first, otherwise you could never make enough progress to kind of take anything out. Although there were also encounters too that didn't have any sort of these healers. They would have encounters with like spiders or like bears or like other animals. So you had this one type of encounter, but then could have this other type of encounter. They didn't really have too many enemies that were like not fun to fight against, but I did kind of feel like if they wanted to, they could have maybe found one or two other archetypes that they could have used, add a little bit more variety. As far as the AI goes in the game, it was fairly decent, but the AI could sort of be cheesed by sort of the local distance or their follow distance that they would have for you. If you kind of stayed sort of on the edge of that, you could kind of get them to come in, but then they wouldn't. And then if you had ranged attacks, you could kind of cheese them a little bit. As far as like actual ways to work around that, like video game AI is a kind of a tough topic, especially in sort of these situations. the thought I was, came to mind to me was like the longer you're in combat or the longer an enemy's in combat, the more you should loosen sort of the tether for like how long they can chase you. Or maybe like if they were in a situation where like they can't path to you, they can't get to you, then you could do a thing and be like, oh hey, let's like give them like a retreat point. So they, if they're being attacked and they can't get to you, then they go to this like kind of hiding point that is sort of safe for them. So then if you're a ranged attacker, it's like, oh great, you have to kind of find them, hunt them down a little bit. And I think that would work great more for like an animal type character because you can run animals off territory, but they will eventually return and things like that. But that being said, the combat, since you do so much of it, it can get very repetitive. And I mean, they do a few things to sort of help us out. They do toward the end of the game they introduce the Magfolk, and that does help I think a fair bit. But it was kind of more like in that last zone that I was in, Galawain's Tusks. That's when I kind of started to notice. I'm like, hey man, I'm just doing the same thing over and over again, and I'm not getting pushed outside of my comfort zone at all. And part of that too was like that was also when I was kind of getting down that stun locking sort of gameplay. So on the one hand, it's like I get to this dominant strategy, and then the combat becomes uninteresting. So it's kind of a classic problem in sort of game design of like players optimizing out the fun of the experience. But I did eventually hit that. Sort of like the one thing I would sort of want to do or think about doing to sort of make things more interesting is just probably try to change the parameters of the combat a little bit more. So I was thinking of, a situation where like maybe you have a situation where you're fighting a lot of ranged enemies and suddenly ranged combat and cover becomes something, you need to start thinking about. One idea could be like holding out against enemies, so it's a combat encounter where enemies are coming like towards you and attacking you or attacking a point. You could also do something where you're like trying to defend a cart moving to a location, and just these are just sort of these differences in kind to sort of make kinds of things you're doing in combat just slightly different than the oh I see an encampment, oh I attack an encampment. It also might be interesting, like there are some bounties that you go out and do, and I was thinking like, well, why aren't you ever like just dueling in these bounties like without a companion? And I know like there are going to be some like builds that are more companion focused, but I mean my thought is you wanna kind of get that in there a little bit. This is the kind of thing that I didn't notice, and I don't know if they were doing this, but the way the systems work in Pillars of Eternity and Avowed, you could have different styles of fighter or priest, etc., based on the statistics that you're using. You could have a priest that focuses much more on, trying to have a very large or radius, right? Or you could have maybe one that has a much smaller radius, but it's much more powerful. And I don't think I noticed this really occurring much at all. It might have been going on, but things just might have been so hectic I didn't see it. It can be kind of hard to like build these sorts of more stat-driven characters and to like have the player notice them, especially if you are trying to like save resources and not have all the characters have all unique animations, and you kind of have to do something. And as far as from the stat perspective, I think if you're doing it, you have to cheese it a little bit and make it like either super obvious or like this priest is like twice the area or hugely greater to double the area, right, of their influence. Enough on that. I think probably the biggest thing that people noticed about this game is that it had some systemic elements, but it wasn't very simulationist. And sort of what I mean by that is that it wasn't really trying to be like a Skyrim or a Kingdom Come Deliverance, which it launched like right next to. And I think that kind of hurt it because people saw, they had played these other games and they were like, oh, this is what this game's going to be like. They hop in and they're like, wait a minute. This is not that kind of game. And I think kind of a good way to sort of make an example of this is buttons versus switches. And what I mean by that is with a button, those are things you have to hit like a checkpoint, and you just like once you hit the button, you're sort of done with it. Whereas with a switch, it's something you can turn on and off, and so you need to understand the context of like how to use the thing. For the most part, you just have to turn it on. But the idea is with a switch, you could also turn it off. You could also be doing other things. You're kind of manipulating as opposed to just hitting checkpoints. In this game, I feel like there was a lot more checkpoint hitting than there was actually like manipulating and simulating sort of situations. But that being said, the ways you could hit that button were pretty varied. You could use spells, you could use weapons, you could use like grenades in the environment, stuff like that. And so with the game loop itself, it really seems to be focused primarily on exploring everything and completing all the content. And with this game loop, this is where I kind of felt the game started to stumble a little bit more, because really the player, they can complete anything as they find it, which is like a very low friction thing. I think some players found it to be like a little bit, kind of a little bit too easy or a little bit too like strange in a sense. And I think they were kind of hoping that there'd have to be some sort of like long-term planning that players would have to do. And like the only mechanic that really rewards long-term planning is like the lockpicks, and those are kind of strange because sometimes they function as like a puzzle get out of jail free card, and like the puzzles aren't that difficult. So it's like, why do I have a get out of jail free card here? I'll just, I always have the thing in the environment, so I can just kind of do it. It just kind of felt sort of strange, or like they had these mechanics already built, and then they kind of just had them, and then they couldn't take the time to really interrogate why they were there. That being said, I think part of the other thing that kind of gets me about this game is that it's kind of big on the tiered loot thing, and I am not a fan of tiered loot, and this game is like entirely built around it. The progression is basically the color of your gear. And since the game is so stingy on upgrade materials, it pulls you back into this explore everything, complete everything sort of loop, unless you start going around and like breaking down unique items. But, from the player perspective, and I'd also kind of think from the developer perspective, they made this cool item that I could conceivably use or switch to at any time, and then they're kind of saying, well, if you actually want to be viable in this game, you have to like break this down and get rid of it. That just doesn't feel particularly nice. Or, as I was playing the game, kind of what I ended up doing is I ended up trying to like do all the content, loot every chest, pick every plant. And when you start to play like that, it becomes less about exploration and it becomes more about like sort of grinding everything out. Especially because there's no respawning, there's no like actual, like what you would think is actual grinding, right? But the grind is essentially not necessarily doing something over and over and over again. It's having to do something over and over again. It's the requirement that people tend to dislike when they say they hate grinding, not the like act of grinding itself. There are games where, people will play them over and over again, even though they're kind of the same every time. They're not grinding the game, they just enjoy the game. And so here, though, because I was required to go through all these things, then it did become a grind. Sort of the problem with this, though, too, is like the balance and tuning of economies like this in game, like item economies in games, is very difficult to get right. And I'm, starting to wonder, is there only the ability to error? Can you only be either require the player to do too much or require the player to do too little? I'm just not really sure where to go with it. I kind of feel bad making that criticism because it's like I don't have a good answer as to how to fix it, beyond just like refine it a little bit more. So like this whole game loop thing though, for me, I just like don't understand like why this was chosen or even if this was chosen. This could have just been more of like a compromise sort of situation where like you have the mechanics and you can do some refinement of them, but you kind of have to go with what you got. That's something I'm sympathetic toward because I've had to do that a lot in games I've worked on where it's like, okay, we have this, we have these mechanics together and this is what I guess what we're doing, because we don't have time to rebuild everything or to make a bunch of weird changes to things. That being said, though, I want to talk about something I did really enjoy, which was the traversal mechanics. Personally, I think in an immersive sim, or one of these sort of undersung elements is like the traversal mechanics. If you have really good ways to get around a game, you really kind of get that immersive sim sort of vibe. This game was not an immersive sim, but they did still give you a lot of that player freedom, uh, especially in the ways to get around. But the sort of downside to this is that I was able to get out of bounds a lot, especially in like the first area. And part of it is that I'm a former quality assurance tester, so like I kind of know how to do this. And I'm also playing on like a lower quality PC, so I'm wondering if that's causing some of this. I don't. That's just a hunch. And the game itself, does lean into sort of the verticality of some of the environments, and there's lots of like rewarding like little secrets to find. So the player is kind of gonna try stuff. And initially, though, when I started going out of bounds, is because I was trying to reveal parts of the map. And eventually I'm like going through this area and I'm like, wait a minute, like I'm seeing some really weird like geometry, and there was like a hole in the terrain there. What's going on? That's kind of when I started to realize that I wasn't supposed to be there, and that I was just exploring parts of the map I wasn't supposed to be able to get to. So sort of my sort of solution to that would be like, just don't let me explore those places. But of course, on top of that though, I'm also like using the dash ability to sort of like get to places I'm not supposed to get to, sort of like as a poor man's, Blink from like the Dishonored games. And, I think there was clearly an element of like me just playing the game the way it wasn't really meant to be played, especially in a traversal. So that was kind of strange. Also, like after I dashed, sometimes I couldn't like holster my weapons, so that like kind of bugged me a little bit. It always reset when I changed, or when I moved to a new area, so it wasn't that big of a deal. And it doesn't affect the game at all. And so now I want to talk a little bit about the story and narrative. I have not played Pillars of Eternity, the isometric games. I kind of want to after this game, though. So if that was your plan, I think it's going to work out. Although I do kind of have a feeling that like the Pillars of Eternity sort of series deviates a fair bit from generic fantasy and generic RPGs. Maybe a little bit too much. I feel like the Living Lands, like the place where this game takes place, almost does this even more so. This is sort of like a struggle, but I kind of have to bring it up. Forcing the player to be a godlike, it works great for the narrative, but it's kind of a big ask for like your average player to be like a mushroom head. Like the sort of weirdness and all this stuff does not help this game appeal to like a mass market type of thing. So, real RPG fans kind of know what Obsidian is, and they're not really going to worry about like some of this weirdness going on. And they're going to be like, okay, yeah, we just kind of let Obsidian cook. But like to a weekend gamer who's like not totally sure about this, they're probably going like, what the fuck? Why do I have a fungus on my face? There's sort of this element, and I maybe lamented that people tend to play idealized versions of themselves in RPGs, which is, of course, why I played a short, balding dwarf in Baldur's Gate 3. But more importantly, having fungus grow out of your face is not necessarily an ideal thing. So this kind of created this whole premise, ended up kind of being an uphill battle. Which is kind of funny because other parts of the level design removed a lot of friction. So I kind of had this question. It's like, well, like, the first things I'm doing in this game kind of add a lot of friction, and then you can just immediately take it away. It's like kind of the reverse of a filter. But I mean, then again, like every RPG kind of has this problem anyway, because some of the biggest choices you make in an RPG is at the start of the game. The problem is that you know the least about the game when you're starting it. So, when I'm looking through all the backgrounds and stuff, it's like, okay, I can be like, a noble or whatever. Like, one of them is like called Court Augur, and I'm like, look, I don't want to drill holes for the king, okay? I want to be like someone important. So, I did not pick that background initially until I heard that, from other people, like, oh, it's a great background. It works well with the setting. So, and that being said, writing itself, I think, was pretty good. Like, the attributes and backgrounds did give a lot. It was fairly consistent as well. Throughout the whole game, I mean, you guys definitely must have did a pass to be like, okay, like, what would an Adira noble say at this point? What would a court augur do? I never felt like those choices stopped mattering. As far as the writing itself, I'm not a writer except for when I write. I feel like it mostly improved throughout the game. Some of the beginning areas I felt like there was still a little bit of like finding the footing of like what kind of tone, what kind of feeling you want to have for this. But as I started playing more, I started to like it, and I think as the story got going, as I kind of realized where things were headed, it was definitely a lot more fun. Well, I shouldn't really say fun, and maybe interesting is the better word. Engaging. My other sort of major criticisms, though, and I've kind of noticed this with a few of Obsidian's more recent games, is that I felt like there was too much of an angle, which sounds kind of strange to say, but like Obsidian has always coded factions as good or evil. Like Fallout New Vegas, like everyone loves to bring up, but like let's be honest, they code a good faction and an evil faction pretty early on. The thing though that I think they did that doesn't always kind of translate to some of the later games is that things get more complicated along the way. This didn't entirely happen, I felt like, in this game, especially with like the Adiran Living Lands sort of conflict. I had to bring my own defenses, I felt, to this like Adiran envoy situation. And it was interesting to be cast as an Endearin because I had to reconcile that situation, then also kind of deal with this concept of like this rogue element from my own country. And it's like, am I going to play defense for them? What do I want to say? It was kind of interesting, but the sort of weird thing that kind of got to me is like, I'm like kind of appointed by the king to do stuff. Like I'm an envoy here. Shouldn't I have a little bit more diplomatic power? Shouldn't the people sacking cities have a little bit more diplomatic consequences? I mean, essentially, the only thing I noticed is that if you return to Paradise, you can talk to the ambassador and both be like, "What the hell was that? Like, you can't just sack a city." And like also the reasons to return to Paradise are kind of limited because I think there's maybe like one quest to do, and it's like unless you're going to be a super completionist, there's no reason to go back to Paradise. Like I only went there kind of to check to see if the ambassador would say something, but it was cool that he did. So honestly, like I think probably one of the weakest parts of the game is the fact that like you exhaust one area, you go to the next area, exhaust that area, and then go to another exhaust. It's like you're kind of doing this like colonial exploitation of like the game itself, each place you go. Which is, I mean, maybe there's something there, but it's also not the funnest gameplay. Um, as far as the whole like plot with finding a new deity sort of thing, I felt like that worked out pretty well. I definitely was initially open to the deity when things started, and then I really heavily started to question that stance that I had. That did really kind of work out. As far as the colonizer narrative, I just like coming back to that. It felt kind of forced, just because there was a lot of like differences than what I would typically expect in a colonizer narrative. I got the feeling that this is more like a taming of the old west sort of situation, like anarchy to organization, freedom rather than like freedom to oppression. It was really strange because I was like, if I was an outcast that was living in a place with no law or order, adherence showing up, yeah, it's kind of bad, but it also kind of means I can start a business and not get robbed in the street. You know, there can start being some real development in some of these areas. And I just kind of felt like the game needed a little bit more of a devil's advocate in the for the adherents. Unless I was supposed to be playing the devil's advocate, in which case, like I guess maybe sort of, but that's kind of a strange sort of situation. And yeah, I think like the other thing that sort of hurts the colonization narrative, to me, it didn't necessarily strike me as there being many people born in the living lands, besides Zarops. I think it was like third born, there was definitely some children running around, but for the most part, it was very, there were no kith like come from the continent, no original peoples and things like that that are still there. So, kind of gave me this feeling of like, well, this is a bunch of people who all come from other places. How is this, necessarily a colonialism scenario? It's a little bit more of a displacement scenario than anything else. So, but I think like now that I'm talking about the story and writing, I have to bring up the most important thing, which is that there were no romances in the game. And I understand that like Obsidian has kind of stated that they kind of felt romances are contrived and unrealistic. There's also this problem though too of like, well, you understand this, but then you don't give it to the player, and it's like sometimes you say you don't understand the zeitgeist to the players, and sort of my thought is like, well, no, I think you understand what players want. You just don't want to give it to them. If you're designing your systems for what players expect, and you design your levels to be frictionless and what players can sort of do everything, like it to me it's hard for me to say like, well, you don't understand what players want. It's like you kind of know what players want. You're either choosing or otherwise unable to give the players what they want. Like, are the players being naughty and you don't want to give it to them, or is this like, it just feels kind of weird to do? I mean, like I understand like not wanting to do it, but sometimes like you kind of have to do it anyway. Or it was kind of strange because like everyone was saying they wanted like romance options, which is a weird thing to say, but it's what people expect. At some point, you just got to give the people what they want. You don't want to stand away between people and their fun. If people are going to do that, you should at least poke fun at them, right? I mean, these are the people that want to romance a fish man or a Muppet. You can make fun of them for their choices, um, and maybe you should. But with that being said, yeah, I think Avowed is definitely a better game. I feel like it got released in just a weird time, and I think people coming back to it are probably, when they can really view it on its own merits, are going to see it as a more interesting game than it was. I heard there were plans for like DLC or plans for some other stuff. I'm definitely kind of curious as to where that goes. I'll have to, maybe I'll do a follow up on more thoughts after all that stuff comes out. But uh, that's all I really got to say about that for now. And I mean, I know like court augur and like drill augur is spelled differently, but I mean that's just immediately where my head went. With court augur, I can't get over that.